Hey, Jason, thank you so much for being here today.
Hey man,
Really
thanks for
appreciate it.
inviting me.
Yeah, no, I've been wanting to talk to you for a long time. I love the work that you're doing with SEL. I love the work that you're putting out in terms of DEI and basically letting everybody know about these things that are landmines throughout all of academia, right? And it's it's good to have people on multiple different areas from multiple different sources reinforcing this need to do something about this. And I think your experience in public education and is invaluable. And I've loved the things you put out. But for my audience who may not know who you are, tell us a little bit about yourself, what it is that you do and what you're working on.
So obviously I'm Jason Littlefield and
Mhm.
I'm the executive director of Empowered Pathways and one of the co-founders of Free Black Thought and now the recent co-host of a podcast called Reformation Radio. And essentially all three of those vehicles serve different purposes in my advocacy for the classical liberal Enlightenment era. And each one of those three vehicles, I would get to put forth some different energy into that effort.
Okay. Well, let's just start there then. Let's just start. What is classical liberalism, right? Well, I don't think you need to define it. I think there is a definition. What is it?
Right.
And what does it promote? And what does it go against?
It promotes the individual as the primary source, excuse me, as the primary source of political power, as the primary driver of where does the moral worth go, individual rights, and some of the virtues of classical liberalism are pursuing truth, beauty, and goodness. And then with the successor ideology or wokeism, the virtues there are nihilism and cynicism. And the thought of classical liberalism is essentially, some of those core Judeo-Christian values. And the main one is selflessness, love, which is the awareness of others' individuality.
Mm-hmm.
So that multiple thousand-year-old idea, and then Aristotle ethics, just this idea of how do we uplift and fortify the individual, and how do we build a society around that principle. Whereas the meritocracy and individualism and the belief that we're all created equal, those are some of the values associated with classical liberalism. And then the competing values are diversity, equity, and I won't say inclusion, I'll say repressive tolerance, because
Yeah.
that's the actual value that's displayed.
Mm-hmm.
And also the Enlightenment is the core philosophy of classical liberalism, and the successor ideologies, the replacement value system is postmodernism,
Right.
which the core of that is just deconstructing and dismantling and denying objective truth, which I guess some of that is maybe fun to think about in pockets or on the outskirts, or poetry or tea
Right.
houses. But as far as largely organizing a society,
Mm-hmm.
uh, objective truth is necessary.
Yeah.
And what I also have discovered is that when we deny the individual, like the successor ideology does, because its purpose to erode the individual and ultimately erode individual autonomy and individual sovereignty, because once those things are achieved, once the classical liberal order Enlightenment era is overthrown, then utopia will emerge,
Right. Well,
which
and I
that's nonsensical. And what happens is denying the individual sets up a system of dehumanization in which those capacities of prejudice, aggression, and cruelty are cultivated,
Mm-hmm.
and our in-group bias preference is cultivated. So this movement is, it's cultivating racism, it's cultivating bigotry, it's cultivating dehumanization.
Mm-hmm.
So the ills that we're seeing, the human conflict that we're seeing, is largely attributed to the successor ideology / wokeism,
Right.
so that it will achieve this political goal. And I believe that once we, the collective, identify that situation, then hopefully we can have different conversations, because I believe that that's the conversation that needs to be had, and that's the conversation that has not been had by
Right.
even quote unquote non-woke, the really the entire non-woke community isn't
Mm-hmm.
really talking about how this movement is a complete rejection of that classical. I mean, it's an experiment. It's
Yeah.
not a given. This idea that the individual has worth and value, it's not something that was given. It's an idea that took, we can maybe say, up until the 1990s to maybe kind of actualize. So it's a long march of human progress.
Right.
I extended it, and still there is no perfect human system. There's always going to be an element of suffering.
Mm-hmm.
And denying the individual in order to alleviate human suffering is just magnifying that situation.
So what would you say, though? Because I think the woke come at it this way, especially in terms of the word inclusion, right? Because there's a legal definition of the word inclusion, and we all must remember that critical race theory devolved partly from critical legal studies, right? And critical legal studies all law is built on language,
Mm-hmm.
right? And there is a specific legal definition for the word inclusion, and the Supreme Court has said that means the word inclusion implies without fail the exclusion of something else. Right. And so when you talk about the word inclusion, I think it gets really deceptive, especially the way that the DEI or the CRT movement uses it, because everyone thinks of it at its face value. Let's include everybody. But what they're really doing is using, and I think they do the same thing with in-group processes, because, and I'll get to that in a second, but what they use this word is to say, no, to make the audience, so to speak, believe that everyone should be included. But what they're really saying is no, because the inclusion is not independent. It's with equity, right? And equity denotes a measurement of percentages based upon groups, right? So they claim to be about the individual, like classical liberalism or the Enlightenment. We want we want to make sure there's a representation of trans or people of color, but even within that, they group them into groups, LGBTQIA, right? And they constantly expand, or BIPOC, people of color, indigenous people. So they come at you kind of with this classical liberal sheen, right? To where Americans feel that, and they're like, oh yeah, that's right. But then they remove the veil, and you see behind it, would you agree with this, that you see behind it that it's really not about the individual, it's about group identity and lumping everybody into tribes and then pitting those tribes against each other.
Yeah, and I will say not only a veil, but also good intentions. Not only that classical liberal veil, which is maybe some people are using it to deceive, but then others, and I believe that this is the most case scenario. Most have no idea that the philosophies and the practices that they are using are dehumanizing and contributing to the human suffering. Mm-hmm. Because whenever you place somebody on the outside of the circle of us, whenever you put somebody on the outside, you psychologically justify harming that person. Mm-hmm. And not just that person, but also people that look like them, since you've completely dehumanized people. And we do that all the time. Right. we separate our, teachers from students, just something that simple, but done on those micro levels all day. And then once you add the element of race, and then you throw in those emotions of resentment and shame, and you start kind of adding to what you've already done, and really creating that capacity for not just prejudice, but now we're starting to build up aggression and cruelty.
Right. Well, and I think you hit on a good point there, that there are good boundaries to have, like such as the boundaries between a teacher and a student, right? But when you start injecting identity specific into that, that creates a whole level. That's Jim Crow 1.0, right? When you're talking about discrimination, because that always comes with that you could say, in theory, that you're discriminating against students if you don't give them the same level of platform in a classroom, right? That's kind of the postmodern epistemological argument, right? That there are different ways of knowing, and students who may come from a different background may have just as good of a way of knowing as the teacher who's trying to teach them. And so they create they want to create a balance in the classroom that doesn't rightfully belong there, because you don't go to school to learn from the student to the teacher. You learn from the teacher to the student, right? And so this is kind of the breakdown of education that we're seeing, is that we must give rise, and this is always on a political spectrum too. I think that's the one thing that I always try to hit, and I'd wonder if you agree with this, that really this is not about identity. This is not about you being LGBTQIA. It's not about you being black or white. It's not about you being gay or straight. It's not about you being any of those things. What it is trying to homogenize a space to a political ideology. And that's so the goal is power, right? That's the postmodernist Marxist end of this, right? Is that that they want to achieve institutional power for a certain ideology. And that's what we're seeing in schools right now.
Right. And they've weaponized the ideologies, and the identities. They have weaponized our biologies against us.
Yeah.
And as soon as we realize that, I believe that we can begin to step away and peel back from using these destructive tools.
Yeah.
Once we can recognize, that's just this Marxist framework. And it's a framework I don't have to use. I don't have to believe these people are good and these people are bad. I don't have to assume that you are oppressed and you are an oppressor. And it's not about those identities, because I know individuals that represent all of those communities, all of the marginalized communities that speak out against the ideology as a solution, as a framework.
Yeah.
And they are excluded and they are treated horribly. So really it's a matter of, where do we begin? Yes, of course, all of these issues are very real. The human experience sucks a lot of the times. Which framework are we going to use to build our society? And right now, the slow burn has been, we're using philosophies and tools that are designed to break down the individual and destroy the past.
Right.
There's no other plan or purpose.
Right. And I think you hit on something really good there, because when you talk about the classical Enlightenment, the first institutional use of Enlightenment thoughts and values in the world was the Declaration of Independence, right? I mean, you had John Locke and stuff before that. You had philosophers, going back to Aristotle, going back to many thousands of years before that. But to have it instituted the way it was Thomas Jefferson and the founding fathers in that era putting this down on paper and saying, look, we're more than just a collection of our colonies versus the homeland. We're more than just a collection. We all have individual rights, right? And that is predicated by whether you believe that they use different terminology, but Jefferson said nature and nature's God, meaning that it's not endowed to me by a king or a DEI officer or anyone else, right? It's endowed to me by the fact that I exist.
Yes.
That's it, right? And I think, would you agree that wokeism and the ideology that we're dealing with, this postmodern Marxist way of structuring thought in the world, are trying to break that down and say, look, no, you are nothing without your group.
Yes, exactly. I mean, that's true. It's a complete rejection of the Enlightenment. It believes the Enlightenment is racist, and because of those ideas that were put forth, humans are bad, so we have to destroy that. You know, our founding fathers, they put forth a very radical, extremely radical set of ideas that they themselves could not even live up to. But
Mm-hmm.
I believe that, you know, maybe they hoped that for the future.
Yeah.
And it took a war to actualize that radical vision. So what we're seeing today now, it's emerging. It's not just in the culture. Now it's starting to get into the political class, but we're starting to see these radical ideas of equity, which is equal outcomes. We're starting to see those ideas advance and be kicked down the road for future generations to deal with.
Mm-hmm.
Just like it's that same radical ideas, and it's going to take, you know, every single time that this ideology has come into place, it's
Mm-hmm.
a lot of death.
Yeah.
And the ideology is essential, that collectivism,
yeah.
whichever variety, whichever part of the planet, whichever moment in time of human history, so that's what I'm saying. There is something within us that does not react well
Mm-hmm.
to the collectivism.
Well, because that is the basis of the idea of the American experience, right? And going through time. Now, we all recognize that slavery was wrong. It was wrong when it was here before the founding. It was wrong during the founding. It was wrong all the way leading up to the Civil War. It was the discrimination that came after that in the South, and for various different reasons, but was all wrong. But just like a human being, a collection of human beings is going to perfect itself and get better over time, and that's the goal, right? Is that and it seems to me that wokeism, I call it Marxist identitarianism, because it takes the you know, all of our friend James Lindsay was just recently banned from Twitter. You know, it's the idea that you have to believe this in order to be a good person negates the freedom to think, speak, and do on your own terms. Now, of course, there are always boundaries to that, right? You have laws. You can't just go and hurt somebody. You can't threaten somebody. You can't stalk somebody. You can't do those kinds of things. But what that has been in the American framework is a freedom within the boundaries. Now it seems like we're trying to restrict the boundaries further and further down when it comes to exactly what we say, how we say it, how we educate.
Yes,
right?
Because remember, it's that idea of complete taking over of autonomy.
Yeah.
And that's what it will work to do. And of course, it's going to have to, you know, it's not going to be an overnight thing. It's a gradual thing. But once we start, you know, looking at central bank digital coins and some of these other things that are in the not too distant future, but that are like, okay, so these are some mechanisms in the distance that actually are designed to remove autonomy.
Right
now we're just working that through the culture so that somebody later down the road can kind of accelerate it a little bit more, like it's been accelerated from 2017 till now.
Right. Well, and I want to hit this because we're seeing now the term slippery slope. being kind of demonized, as a logical fallacy. And I think that there is some, if you subscribe to that in every form and way of thinking, it can be, but as in all things, context is king. So I prefer to call it a stacked incentive, right? It's something that's leading to something, not necessarily something that's falling away. Mm-hmm. And so we're stacking incentives over the long march, right, through these institutions towards limiting not necessarily the autonomy we accept as being pro forma today, but what the limiting of that pro forma autonomy today, tomorrow, 20 years from now. And with each succeeding generation, you lose, especially as you break down the history, right? And the connection to Jefferson or the connection to the ideas that undergirded this, going back, as early as the Greatest Generation, in World War II. As we remove those ties that bind, it reminds me a little bit of the Brave New World. And this is where I wanted to get into your work on SEL, because it seems like social emotional learning seems to be an apparatus to stack these incentives mentally, physically, emotionally over, through our institutions to say, here is your moral ideology. Here is your way of fixing yourself, mm-hmm. By leaning on the institution.
Yes.
Right. To provide you with the support you need to be a functional person in society. So how would SEL in that frame, what are you seeing as far as the dangers of SEL? What is it? And why should we be worried about it?
Well, it is trying to figure out how to describe it. So I was an SEL specialist for Austin Independent School District from 2014 to 2021.
Okay.
And what it started out being a framework that essentially fortified the individual and increased relationships, because it talks about self-awareness and self-management, social awareness, relationship skills, and decision-making skills.
Okay. All good things, right?
Good things.
Right.
All good things. And, growth mindset, resilience, grit, values, all of those things,
Character education.
That was a way to kind of frame it and familiarize it. But I did learn that SEL really views character education in a negative light.
Right. That's why I brought that up. Yeah.
And then I realized, because character education, it focuses on the individual.
That's right.
But around 2018, I noticed a really change what the trainings that I was going to, the books we were reading, some of the trainings that my team went to. We started doing equity work and started asking a lot of questions. And as we all know, that did not go well. And at the time, I thought that myself and Brett Weinstein were the only people in the world going through this.
Right. It's designed that way, though, to make you feel like you're on an island, though, right?
Right.
But I want to clarify something. So SEL, the way because I'm also an educator, right? So I've taught at private schools, and I went through the whole growth. You had the book, The Growth Mindset, and you had all of those kinds of things. I think we're about the same age, you and I. I'm almost 37 or so, and so when I went through education school, these were things that were coming up, and as I got further into my career, they became a part of professional development. But social emotional learning, the way that I remember it in the outset, was geared towards students who had trauma or issues that prevented them from being fully acclimated to a social situation, to where there would be, so it was a targeted push more so than it was a blanket push. Would you agree with that? At its outset, like the way it kind of began.
Not where I was.
Okay.
And we were intentional about promoting it to be like just a tier one. This is that blanket approach, but it is something that can be used and weaponized and manipulated to achieve those goals. And so around 2020, December of 2020, CASEL, the Collaborative for Academic and Social and Emotional Learning, they changed the whole definition of SEL to be reflective of the successor ideology. So now 99.9% of SEL is rooted in the philosophies and practices that believe the individual is the root of injustice.
Right. So the critical social justice ideology.
Yes.
When you say successor ideology, just to make sure that's clear.
The critical social justice, the wokeism. So,
right. Which is the S in ESG. I just want to point that out.
Right.
It is, and that's not necessarily a discussion I want to get into today, but there is money being made off of SEL.
There's a lot of money being made on SEL. And, I'm not here to bash all of SEL. I'll get into that in a little bit. But what I did notice, it's not just SEL, it's SEL, it's the DEI bureaucracies and initiatives, and anti-racism. Those three main structures are the three structures driving the ideology, and it touches the individual, each individual, pre-K through retirement age.
Okay. Yeah, I agree with that. Let's take the audience a little bit through, because I love your knowledge on this and your experience with it is invaluable. I want to so you talk about the structures. We got DEI, we've got CRT. CRT is more the ideological base, but anti-racism. What is anti-racism? Because everybody takes that as face value, right? Mm-hmm. You want to be against racism. How does it differ from the way that we see it at face value? What is it actually compared to how we view it at face value?
Well, one thing is the definition of anti-racism is this extremely secular thing. Okay. And one thing that I learned is that the way that I approach racism is definitely wrong by the ideologues. What's interesting as I'm trying to figure out this definition is I also did anti-racism work.
Right.
As part of, and one of the things I was part of a yearly cohort, and we met every month, and we spent more time talking about what a horrible person Thomas Jefferson and Elvis Presley were, rather than what are we doing for our children?
Right.
How are we decreasing racism?
Well,
you're either anti-racist or you're a racist.
Right. Well,
and there's this idea that, race is power plus
identity, right?
Identity.
Right, yeah.
So essentially, and then I also learned through my training that all white people are racist. So,
right.
I mean, really, I was at
regardless
a
of intent, right? I mean,
I was at a training, and that was articulated and accepted by everybody there. So, right. These Maoist struggle sessions that people talk, like I've spent hundreds of hours in those types of trainings and situations and conversations.
Well, let me see if you agree with this, because when I look at the term anti-racism, I just go to Kendi, because when you write the book called How to Be an Anti-Racist, within that, I think you find their functional definition, right? It is, and it defines anti-racism explicitly in terms of public policy, right? It's all based upon, where there is inequity, there is racism, and the inequity, which is racism, comes from racism. So it is circular, right? But that is all derivative of policy, institutional, cultural, and government based. And that's why I see anti-racism as a mechanism of diversity, equity, and inclusion, because DEI is an office. It's a Politburo. It's a bureaucracy. It's an institution designed to wedge itself into the institution, right?
Yes.
And so anti-racism, because they always talk about anti-racist policies. And what are anti-racist policies? Policies that discriminate against individuals from historically oppressive groups on the front end of the policy in order to create equity of outcome for other groups on the back end. Right?
Yes.
Would you agree with that?
Yes.
Okay. So how
and also in the culture, just like through books and movies, you know, it gets in. All of these things are getting in through the culture. And what I know about the brain and neuroplasticity is that our brains are wired to accept the culture that's placed on it.
Right. And that's what I wanted to get into now that we have a good baseline of those two things, because you talked about the structures, right? You talked about the structures. So how does SEL do what you were just talking about with students? Because there's, I think, a misconception right now that's dangerous, that if we fix the curriculum, if we fix, getting sexually explicit books out of schools, if we fix removing, anti-racist baby from the curriculum, if we fix all of that, then this problem is going to magically go away. And what I keep trying to say to people is no, because that's just the part they want you to notice. It's what the left hand that it is doing. And I think that's where SEL really comes into play. Would that be right?
I would say that would be right. Yes. And it's, just conditioning the brain to accept, this is the way the world is.
Yeah.
This is the way I'm supposed to feel because I'm this kind of person. Or, I'm supposed to feel this. And something else that we're seeing is, kids are reading about anxiety all day, if they're kind of getting into that. And then, you start to get in your head. Am I
anxious? Am I,
right.
do I want to take my own life? And, or do I, am I a racist? Do I feel it's when kids are that impressionable, right?
Yeah. And if the ideology is purpose to erode the individual, that's how it's doing it.
Okay.
It's chipping away at the mind and the soul of the individual.
Okay. So how does SEL, how is it manifesting itself now? What can we be? We can obviously see the blatant things, the books. How is it manifesting under the surface? If you want to use the term the iceberg, where is it coming from, and where does it go, and how does it get put out there?
It's unseen. And the reason why I say it's unseen and unknown is because it's been happening in teacher trainings since 2017. So before it really blew up and there's a mass awareness of this situation is not right, teachers have been getting trained in it. So their mindset and their lens has accepted this new filter, and because they have that filter, that's how they interact.
Right.
So what I've done, I've developed a different training model. Instead of spending, I don't really keep up with current SEL trends because I understand the playbook. I know the philosophy. I've reached out to Castle multiple times to have a discussion about their SEL framework versus.
I bet they don't discuss it with you, do
they? They have not. They said that I have made some very good points, and they can see that I am very passionate and careful about what I'm doing. But there's been no meeting because what I've developed. It's called empowered humanity theory, And it's essentially 6 attitudes and practices designed to fortify the individual and strengthen relationships. It centers human dignity and cultivating compassion, cultivating those positive human traits, and mitigating and breaking down those capacities of prejudice, aggression, and cruelty.
Right.
So I've developed this other model to work with DEI bureaucracies, SEL curriculum, and something that Eric Smith and I are working on. We'll actually going to be talking about it tomorrow, but we're calling it fourth wave anti-racism. That we are elevating this anti-racist movement that we're in the midst of now, and we're elevating it in ways that address mitigating those capacities of prejudice, aggression, and cruelty, and finding pragmatic ways to strengthen and celebrate our common humanity through that classical liberal framework.
And I can see that, and I think everyone who watches my podcast knows how much respect I have for Eric Smith, and I've really followed your work and what you've done with him and Free Black Thought. I think it's amazing. But I want to challenge that a little bit. I just and let you make the case to someone like me who might be a little skeptical, okay? Because just as you had mentioned earlier, SEL, maybe, it largely started out as a positive pursuit, right? And before the advent or the injection of SEL into the public school system via teacher trainings through colleges of education, all of those things, it seems to me that there wasn't really a database need for it. And you could see the same thing kind of with DEI, right? And anti-racism policies, right? Because we were largely moving, although there wasn't you couldn't measure it in terms of group outcomes, so you can't accept that premise of, if you accept the premise that there is injustice due to racism because there are unequal outcomes, then you have to accept the premise that anti-racism policies and DEI are necessary. If you don't accept that premise, that you could say that there are a myriad of other problems, cultural, family, individual, that can be a part of that, then you can't accept the DEI premise. You can't accept that as the fix. So do you see any concern, because I fully trust that your and Eric's goals for fourth wave anti-racism or the empowerment theory are really intentionally good. Do you have a fear that because we're using kind of that same structure, that we are in a way accepting the premise that it was needed in the first place? Do you fear that might be a bridge to have your theory and your method of doing this taken over by the same cohort that took over Castle in the first place?
I heard a couple of different questions there.
Okay. So are you fearful? Let's get about to this. Do you think that your framework as kind of a replacement for Castle's social emotional learning could be taken over in the same way that Castle was before it?
No, not looking at those 6 attitudes and practices.
Okay.
There's no way to adjust and change those.
Okay.
One thing that I am, I guess, a little fearful, or not maybe fearful, but because of, I've talked about SEL, that this framework, there's a lot of people that are against the intersectional Marxism, but will not work with me to help me get the intersectional Marxism out of SEL.
Okay.
Because it says SEL on it.
Yeah, well, and that's what I don't want to do.
You know what
I want to give you right, and
but what I'll say is that we have no choice but to use those labels, because honestly, I believe we've got maximum of 8 years to stop, to replace the ideas, to replace those ideas in those systems. That if it doesn't happen within the next 8 years, then the Enlightenment era will be over.
Right. Well, and I want to be very clear.
You know, and we've the non-woke movement for the past couple of years is just still kind of this ping pong and back and forth. You know, sometimes I wonder, do people think that we are playing a game of Republicans and Democrats and we're going to wake up and it's 1997 again?
Right. No, I,
you know, do we really understand the magnitude of this situation? And that's really why we're trying to elevate and raise that level of awareness too. Right. Because the only thing that I can think of that I can do is replace the ideas coming from every single DEI bureaucracy, every single SEL curriculum, and how we're talking about anti-racism. And empowered humanity theory, it addresses the kernel of truths that those things manipulate.
Okay.
And well, right now
that's a good point.
You know what I'm saying? There's
and I want to point out that I'm not explicitly part of the reason I wanted to have you on was to have this discussion because
you make a good point.
Well, and I want to have, because right now I'm just going to be honest, I'm pretty much for not adopting the language. Now that doesn't mean we can't recognize things, you know. But the one thing I've noticed, and I think the takeover of Castle is evidence of this, that the best of intentions can be easily manipulated over time. Right. And as we're losing touch, and I think you would agree with this, we're losing touch with those Enlightenment values that have undergirded you and me, right? You know, at our age. And we were instilled with that without any SEL to knock us off balance, without any anti-racism as it's being practiced now to knock us off balance.
Well, those things, sorry to cut you off, but
no, go ahead.
A really valid point. So we didn't need them because our values were getting into us in other ways. Whereas now SEL and anti-racism, remember, that's the value replacement system. That's why those things they're plugged in to replace humankind's values and worldview.
I agree. What were those other things, though, in your view, that were placing those values? Because are you saying that we weren't necessarily only getting the values that we believe in school? We were getting them in other areas, right? And so where were they coming from that they're not coming from now?
I would still say schools, families, probably churches, community organizations, but also, teachers, they did form relationships with kids, before SEL, and they did kind of install some, like the morals of stories, when people read the story. Those values and
those kinds of things.
Those values crept in through that way.
Right. Well, and that's where I have really come to the conclusion that we don't have a materials issue, we have a personnel issue, and we have an administrative issue. You know what I mean? And we don't have a curriculum issue or even a methods issue. What we have is, to use their term, a systemic kind of flip of what those undergirding values are. And because I would agree with you, but I got them from church, I got them from my parents, but I also got them from my teachers who got them from their teachers, who got them from their teachers, who got them from their, going back.
Well,
and I think that we've had a wholesale change here in the last 5 years of what is actually being taught at the top of the, the top of the spout there, the pipeline.
We have.
And so what you're proposing is to use the empowerment theory to reclaim the framework that's been instilled largely by this bureaucracy that probably would be difficult to remove, and reclaim the ideology that undergirds it, right? And so that the framework reestablishes itself to an Enlightenment framework. Would that be a good way to steel man what you're saying?
Yes.
Yeah.
Because those systems exist, and there are school districts that Google SEL consultants.
Mm-hmm.
So
yeah,
my name and my site will come up. I don't actively promote and vocalize for SEL, for diversity, equity, and inclusion. I do have a statement on my website that our approach is a graceful rejection of the ideology that is coming out, and that, empowered humanity theory, it does address those kernels of truth. And this can be used to plug it, for those organizations looking to check the DEI box, looking to check the SEL box, knowing that there is a need. So my thinking is, if people within those institutions and organizations, if they began to have conversations such as, do we value the individual? Should we create systems and build our schools and build our communities around fortifying the individual and increasing their well-being? Or do we want to use this framework that relies on eroding that individual completely?
Okay.
Which framework do we want to use? Because there are problems in the world.
Yeah.
And there are situations, workplaces, they do have to figure out, how do we want to get along with each other? So which frameworks do you want to use? Do you want to use a framework? Do you want to build your organization around separating people and othering people and constantly dismantling and using critical theory as a solution tool? Or do we want to center human dignity? Do we want to figure out, how do we strengthen our compassion? Do we want to identify our shared values? And how do I operate within my personal value system? What do we want to promote as an organization? Because that's one of the things that I do promote, is that value-centered identity,
right,
versus the intersectional identity.
Right.
And the values are self-assigned. I don't assign people values, but I do a value setting exercise with a menu of different values so that we can begin to identify what are our core values and how do I make sure that my thinking and my behavior is in line to my core values. And how do I maintain my dignity and the dignity of the people that I'm interacting with in that particular moment? And those things take work. And what DEI, SEL, and anti-racism in this moment, they don't do those things. They are exacerbating the human capacity for prejudice, aggression, and cruelty.
Right. Well, and I would agree with all of those things. I just, my concern is wrapped up in, and I think it's something that is worth discussing across minor disagreements about, methods, but my concern is wrapped up in the pervasiveness of bureaucracy and understanding that bureaucracy is just a conglomeration of people, and that conglomeration of people changes over time. And so if we leave in place something that largely wasn't here until 2014, that has led to where we are now, are we setting ourselves up, even if we get to change the flow or change the ingredients, are we setting ourselves up for a permanent use of this bureaucracy that will, over the long term? Because I think when I look at what Jefferson did, and when I look at what the Enlightenment did, and the founders, and what they were constantly talking about was not themselves, but they were talking about their moment and their posterity. Right. And I think that's what we miss a little bit now, is that everything is about what's happening now. We're conditioned by social media. We're conditioned to constantly change from crisis to crisis, and those crises will last anywhere from 15 minutes to 3 days to a week, and then there's a new one, right? And so it's shortened our attention span so much that we are almost incapable now as a society of thinking about the 20-year, the 40-year, the 50-year, the 100-year, or even caring about that as we go on, as to where the founders or the genesis of the Enlightenment movement was not about them. It was about us.
Yes.
You know what I mean? And it was about 250 years from now. It wasn't about 1776. And that was, I think, Jefferson's mindset when it came to slavery itself, right? Was that we cannot do this right now. Because if we do, we lose our opportunity to build what we could have in 200 years, right? And so what he said was, I did this, y'all got to do this. You know, my children, your children have to take it and move the ball down the road. And so I find credence in what you're saying there, because I think that is part of what you're saying, that we need to, okay, inject this back in and have them take the framework and move it forward. But my concern is that this is not the framework that was given to us by Enlightenment thinking. It's built by the Marxist identitarians, and they seem to know where all the levers are. So that's my only concern. And I want to work with you and Eric and other guys to help, kind of make this woke proof if we can.
Right.
You know what I mean?
It's the current systems, that you said it, they weren't here.
Yeah.
And now people coming up, there's systems that people are inheriting. A lot of this worldview is a worldview that a lot of people have inherited.
Yeah.
So what we and they and every individual within a DEI bureaucracy, they have to examine their tools. They have to examine. We have to have a collective, oh shit moment.
Yeah.
We're working. The tools that we've been given are purposed only for destruction. And not just destruction of things, but destruction of self and destruction of relationships.
Yeah. Yeah. And
so it's just, we have to decouple from the idea.
Okay.
And what I've noticed with empowered humanity theory, even woke people cannot give me specific why it's bad. They tell me that's what we want in the end, but
yeah.
So there's no arguing it.
Well, and let me ask you this: are you concerned at all that the lack of pushback, and this may be giving them way too much credit? Okay, so I'm playing devil's advocate here because I think we do have to have solutions, right? Mm-hmm. We can't just be a naysaying. No. And so I'm searching for solutions within the people I trust, like yourself and with Eric and other organizations and other people. But are you concerned that the lack of pushback could be an indication that they're okay with what you're doing because they can, no, not at all?
No. And so I had, let me see. Maybe 3 years, imagine 3 years of going to work every day and somebody could tell you like, oh, this is where you're wrong. Especially people that like to tell you where you're wrong.
Yeah. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And every time I would bring something up and ask a question, there's no rebuttal.
Okay. Well,
and permanent, avoidance. So
right.
I'll kind of break it down for you. Imagine.
Yeah, that's what I was saying. I would break it down for us so we know what it is that you're.
So the three attitudes are developing a value-centered identity. How do I make, like I said, make sure my personal values are in line with my thinking and my behavior? And then when you're within a group, a working group, what shared values guide that working group? What are the values that everybody has that we can agree upon, and those are the values that are going to drive our work. And then the other is a dignity lens. How do we connect and honor the dignity of self and dignity of others? And the way I break down dignity is breaking down the difference between the human and the being. And the human part is the biology and personality of what you're seeing and hearing and all of that.
Mm-hmm.
And beneath all of our conditioned personalities, and no matter what part of the planet that we're from, no matter how old we are, we all have this being underneath us, and all beings share two distinct qualities, and that's the desire to avoid suffering and the desire to alleviate suffering when we encounter it. So if we're able, how do we see each other, one another, and connect with each other on that level? And how do I make sure that my daily operations, I'm not violating the dignity of myself, nor am I violating the dignity of others due to my interactions?
Yeah.
And then
no, go ahead.
I was just going to say the other attitude is prioritizing and cultivating mindsets of inquiry and compassion over judgment and fear. How do we disrupt those thoughts in the moment of judgment and fear that are limiting yourselves, limiting your own potential, and also those thoughts of fear and judgment that could limit the potential of others, especially in an education setting or in a work setting when we have those snap, fear, and judgment processes. Yeah. So how do we disrupt those? And then how do engaging in practices that build awareness and equanimity, cultivating self-awareness, having your aim, and those self-management. How do I maintain equanimity during chaos?
Can you just define for us equanimity, because I don't want to get it confused with equity?
Sure. Yeah. Thank you for that. Let me take a drink.
Yeah.
Equanimity is essentially the ability to kind of remain calm during chaos, to see things as they are without judgment.
Rationality.
Say it again.
Rationality in a way.
No, not even that, because rationalizing your thinking. For example, I've been in a situation before where somebody was screaming at me, and I wiggled my toes. I said, I'm wiggling my toes in my shoes. Mm-hmm. I looked at the wall. I said, that's a brown wall. And then I went to the person and said, this person is yelling at me. So really just seeing things as they are unfolding without judgment.
I see. Okay.
That's that idea of equanimity. Because when we have that skill, it helps us to not basically flip our lid to where our behaviors are guided by our amygdala.
Right. So the fight or flight as opposed to, I see.
And that's one of those things that that's how conflict and everything erupts.
Right. Well, and I think there is a case to be made that, regardless of race, color, creed, usually you find it in more adverse economic situations, regardless of race, color, creed, but that there is more of an emphasis on the amygdala, on the lizard brain, if you will, the fight or flight mentality amongst people who grow up in that kind of atmosphere, because that's what is shown to them on a daily basis. That's what is instilled. And so
that's the part of their brain that's getting exercised.
Right.
And with neuroplasticity, the brain grows with whatever it exercises. So my thinking is, and then the final practices are practices that build kindness and compassion for self and others, and then practices that celebrate our common humanity, finding those differences. So by incorporating those 6 attitudes and practices into our daily habits and into our societal systems, practicing those things over and over and over will cultivate the brain in ways that make us peaceful and resilient. Mm-hmm. The woke ideology, they blame human autonomy for injustices and all of the harm. Whereas my approach, I'm more about how do we fortify and strengthen that individual? How do we mitigate opportunities for harm?
Right.
Real harm, not woke.
Not saying a word that makes you upset. It's how to deal with the word that was said that makes you upset, right?
Right.
And so then like I said before, I think all of this is good. I think that it is the way that you lay it out. There is merit to it because you're talking about basic human function. You're talking about the way that we react to things. You're talking about the way that people interact with each other, so interpersonal, and that is something that is not often taught enough to a lot of students at a young age, right? I wanted, and this is kind of a little bit tangential, but I think it hits to the problem here is that we have so many kids now on medications that mess with their neuroplasticity in a way, whether you're talking about ADHD or you're talking about antidepressants and things that alter an emotional mental state, even if it's to an nth degree, even if it's necessary in some. But we're seeing this massive, over the last 20 years, injection of these kind of drugs into society. And I am not a conspiracy theorist on this. I just am concerned about, do you think that there is a problem with a kind of chemical way or a chemical barrier that could limit some of the things that you want to do? And I'm not saying that's no reason not to do what you're doing. I'm just saying, does that concern you at all as somebody who's worked with SEL and the good parts of it and the empowerment theory now that's kind of trying to replace the bad that's come about? Do you think are you concerned about this chemical wall with kids specifically?
It's there, but it doesn't, there's nothing I can do about it. I don't see it as a hindrance. It's not something that I worry about or try to figure out how to overcompensate for that.
Yeah. Well, and that's fine. And it literally was a tangent because it's something that when I think about the way that kids react, and everything you're talking about is a good way of training kids specific, right? Because the younger, that's what the woke have gathered too, is that if we can have drag queen story hour, we can inject these kinds of normalcies into or abnormal ways of thinking which is what queer theory is, right? It's an attack on the normal, right? If we can inject the queer way of thinking into the normal, then we're more apt to keep that value system long term, right? And so it was just something that popped into my head because it does concern me because I see so many kids that I think would benefit from exactly what you're talking about.
Yes.
And
well, everybody, I've presented at conferences for insurance workers before. And I did a presentation at South by Southwest a few years ago, and the cameraman came up to me afterwards. He was like, man, if they would have had this when I was a teenager, it would have changed my life. So
that's great.
The ideas that we're putting out there, it's for everybody. It's not it's not just something to plug in and say, oh, now we're going to do this SEL. It's how do we put these attitudes and practices into action? Yeah.
Well, and there seems to be some cognitive behavioral therapy basis to it.
I've heard that.
I'm just in terms of the base.
Yeah.
I'm not saying you're copying anything. I'm just saying that cognitive CBT has proven to be one of the most, if not the most effective form of adult psychotherapy, right? Because you're changing the way that you react to things in your brain. And so I just see this as being maybe a necessarily simpler version of those same principles, the underlying principles of that.
It could be. I've had people come up to me after presentations and say, have you heard of CBT? I've had people say, is this Hinduism, Buddhism, Christianity? All of those things,
Mm-hmm.
which kind of makes me happy, because I was hoping to kind of land on what are just some good habits and good practices that everybody can do.
Yeah.
What are some healthy habits and skills you don't have to pay for? You just put these things into your life and into action. What can we do? And those are the 6 that I landed on.
Well, and I think it reminds me, and I am a fan of The Coddling of the American Mind, right? By Jonathan Haidt, and he talks about the ancient wisdoms that are across all cultures, and I think that you're hitting on that. And I think injecting that, I guess I would say this, that my only concern is not with what you're talking about at all. I think everything that you're talking about is good. I'm just wondering if we can fix the pipeline, so to speak, and maybe that's a different conversation. Yeah. And that is not necessarily your what you're proposing here, but I think that that's more where my mind goes to this, because it's the pipeline itself that has been corrupted, not just what's in it. And that's something.
Once better ideas get into that pipeline,
and there's a case. That is a case.
Like I say, I believe that most people in the pipeline aren't familiar with the tools that they're using.
Yeah.
So I'm hoping to elevate that awareness so that people within that pipeline, they can have conversations. Which tools do we want to use? Do we want to use the intersectional Marxist tools that society has given us? Or is there something else that we can use?
Yeah.
And for those that are saying, is there something else we can use? I'm waving, I'm here for you. This is what my sense of purpose is right now.
Yeah. Well, and I like I said, I think it's all rooted in exactly the things that we need to have our common, to rebuild some of, or if not all of the common humanity of that. And there's totally merit in that. And I see the good that can come from it if we can actually get it into the ether. My other concern are the stacked incentives, because right now, and I think I think you would agree with this statement, that society as a whole, whether you're talking monetarily or you're talking social pressure, peer pressure, because I was always taught by my teachers, peer pressure is the strongest force on the planet, right? That we need to find a way, and this is maybe what I'm talking about more in terms of the pipeline. What are the incentives? How do we change the incentives? And this is going back, I think, to the overarching 50-foot point. How do we change the incentives to move away from the woke ideology that's destroying our relationships and toward more of what you're talking about?
The quickest and easiest and most simplest way is to put the emphasis on the proper noun.
Okay.
Is to put the emphasis on the person, because right now we're incentivizing identities.
Yes.
And because we're rewarding some identities and punishing others, that's the replacement system for meritocracy. That's the replacement system for a competence and character-based society. And is that the way that we want to go? Do we want to go that way of rewarding somebody because of how they outwardly express themselves?
Yeah.
Because there's flaws in that system.
There are. And I think the one thing that we can all recognize, there are flaws in every system, but which one are the less flaws? And I think that's what the Enlightenment hit on, was that there were flaws in that. When you rely strictly on rationalization and have no emotion or have no search for the beauty and worry too much about the objective nature of things, you can get yourself in trouble too. I think that's where maybe eugenicists have have gone off the rails, right? It's like if everything is pragmatism, if everything is data, then you remove the human element, the being element, as you would say. I think that makes us different from the other mammals on the planet, right? And that is, you've really made me think about these things, and I
it's a clash between chaos and rigidity.
Yeah.
You know, and right now with the intersectional marks, like that's a chaos driven system.
Mm-hmm.
And right now, since that is where the power is and that is where the numbers are, we're just increasing the chaos. That's why I believe if we appeal broadly to the Enlightenment era, broadly appeal to that classical liberalism, then maybe we can begin to shift some individuals away from the chaos and back maybe towards the order a little bit, because ultimately it's up to individuals to decide.
Mm-hmm.
Am I going to continue with the ideology? I see that it is philosophically bankrupt and morally destructive. And I don't think that do I think that my great grandchildren are going to benefit under this world where they have no autonomy and sovereignty? Or do I want to try to maintain their abilities to live as sovereign individuals?
That is a great point. And I don't want to pick at you to pick at you. You know what I mean? Because I think a lot of what you're saying, I want to make it woke proof. You know what I mean? And
well,
I think
so the idea of human dignity is woke proof. And the idea that we do have a common humanity, that we do have a shared humanity, is woke proof, because Kimberly Crenshaw prioritizes identity over humanity.
But she would come at you and say,
"No, she openly does."
Well, no, I know, but let me just play devil's advocate for a second, because I know her argument pretty well, right? And she would say that and it's something I've heard her say, is that the prioritization or the seek for equity of people who have largely been excluded, or the seek is in itself a form of humanity, or it is a search for humanity. It just requires some people to give up a base nature or a base of privilege that they've enjoyed over time. So,
but that's not humanity.
Okay. And I'm just playing devil's advocate.
Oh, I know, but I would tell her that same thing. You see how you have to give up one person has to give up something. They don't know what they have to give up, but just this idea of somebody limiting themselves, somebody not pursuing their potential, somebody denying themselves, mm-hmm. That's a dignity violation. That does not honor the dignity of self and others. So
even if it's done on a perceived manner by the person themselves.
But there's no,
because if you want to go back to, and again, I'm just philosophizing, right? But if you go back to the base Christian thing, the Christian doctrine of things, you want to talk about Judeo-Christian values, right? There is a measure of virtue and sacrifice, right? And I think that's where the intersectionalist, the woke philosophy gets Christians a lot, is that they, do unto others as you would have them do unto you, but really, love your neighbor as yourself, which means that you have to give them full preference over yourself. And I think that's where they wedge that, and then you have a split. And there's some that says, wait a minute, I'm a person too. What I think matters, and my skin color shouldn't be involved in that. That's where you and I sit, right? And then there's the others that says, no, because of this identity, because I've had this, I must give more, which in and of itself can be seen as a virtue, as long as you're not being forced to do it, mm-hmm. right? That's kind mm-hmm. of what they weaponize. But how much of it is compelled as opposed to force, right. And that's where I think we get into the sticky situation is, are we compelling speech? Are we compelling action by weaponizing empathy? Yeah.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. All of that for the sheer purpose of eroding the classical liberal order.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think you're right there. I think you are. Well, I don't want to keep you too long, and I want to give you the last word. I want you to just give me your best summation of why the empowerment theory and what you're doing is virtuous, and because like I said, I'm with you, man. I want what you want. You know what I mean? And although I have questions, I think what you and Eric and Free Black Thought and the empowerment theory and everything you're doing is a virtuous and good intent, and has a lot, I think, a majority of of practical ways to actually instill this into the individual.
Mm-hmm.
And that's something I want to see. But I want you to be able to make your case without me pushing back on you at all. And then,
Sure.
And then I want you to tell us where to find you, because I think everybody should be following Jason. But first, let make your case, brother.
Well, currently, social emotional learning, DEI, and anti-racism are touching every single individual, not just in America, but in Western democracies across the world. And if those three systems do not adopt a set of ideas or a guiding framework that values the individual and rejects the ideology, then the classical liberal Enlightenment era is over. And the notion of a sovereign and free individual will be a very short blip on human history. I have developed those set of ideas. I do professional development and training, but the framework is available for free online, so people can look at that and make sense of it, what they will, and begin implementing now.
Yeah. Well, where can we find it? Where can we find it so we can point everybody over there?
empoweredpathways.org. And you can also follow me on Twitter at Jason the THEE human. I identify as a human.
Good. Me too. And man, I'll tell you this. This has been a great discussion, and I've enjoyed it thoroughly. It's. I think the difference between us and those that we may, or the people on the pro-human side, if you want to go that direction, use that terminology, against the more identity side, is that we can have these conversations and parse out things that we may not fully agree on, but find our common ground, right? Yep. And because we know that both of us want to move forward, and we want to make sure that this ideology for our posterity, right, is better than the way we left it, right?
Exactly.
And so, Jason, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you so much, man.
I want to have you back and continue this discussion as we move forward into the good fight. Appreciate it.
For sure. Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.